Welcome. We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and we've gone back to the beginning before, if you can put it this way, in the beginning, as detailed in Genesis, to the era of the Paleolithic period along the Mediterranean coastline and the Neolithic period in Western Europe. We are looking at the hominy, or the hominoid, or the hominid, and the Neanderthals. And we've come across this lecture from Providence College, Nashville, USA, lecture series, What Human Genomics Can Tell Us About Adam and Eve. This is a Roman Catholic perspective, but it could be interesting. And it reads, in recent years, biologists have sequenced the genomes of numerous individuals scattered throughout the planet. They have also been able to obtain genome information from extinct hominin species, including Neanderthals and Denisovans. Altogether, this data suggests that the human species evolved from a small population of individuals living in East Africa about 100,000 years ago. In this lecture, using the inseparable and harmonious benefits of faith and reason, Father Nicanor Austracio, OP, will not only explore the scientific basis for these claims, but also begin to reconcile them with the truths of the faith revealed in sacred scripture. Father Nicanor Austracio, OP, Ph.D, S.T.L.Father, Nicanor, Pier, Giorgio, Austracio, OP, is an associate professor of biology at Providence College. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Engineering, Bachelor of Science in Engineering, Bioengineering from the University of Pennsylvania, a Ph.D in Biology from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and a Bachelor of Sacred Theology and a Licentiate in Sacred Theology, both from the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., USA. Father has also served as Fellow of the International Human Frontier Science Program for the Ludwig Institute for Cancer Research at University College London. The subjects for his research and published work range from the life cycle of yeast to bioethics to moral theology. His most recent work is a book titled Biomedicine and Beatitude, an introduction to Catholic bioethics, published in December 2011 by the Catholic University of America Press. Here, saying a population of individuals living in East Africa about 1,000 years ago. Altogether, this data suggests that the human species evolved from a small population of individuals living in East Africa about 100,000 years ago. So we've looked at supposed evidence data online, and we are looking at list of first human settlements. This is a list of dates associated with the prehistoric peopling of the world, first known presence of Homo sapiens. This list is divided into 4 categories: Middle Paleolithic, before 50,000 years ago; Upper Paleolithic, 50,000 to 12,500 years ago; Holocene, (12,500 to 500 years ago), and modern age of sail, and modern exploration. List entries are identified by region. In this case of genetic evidence, spatial resolution is limited, or region, country, or island, with the date of the first known or hypothesized, let's guess that, modern human presence or settlement, although Paleolithic humans were not sedentary. Human settlements does not necessarily have to be continuous. Settled areas in some cases become depopulated due to environmental conditions such as glacial periods or the Toba volcanic eruption. Early Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa. In paleoanthropology, the recent African origin of modern humans, also called the out of Africa theory, OOA, recent single origin hypothesis, RSOH, replacement hypothesis, or recent African origin model. It's the dominant mode, or modern concept, right? From as early as 270,000 years ago. Although these early migrations may have died out and permanent Homo sapien presence outside of Africa may not have been established until about 70 to 50,000 years ago. Okay, that's all based on probably based around the out of Africa theory. There are many who debunk it, say it's incorrect. There's modern scientists, etc. Okay, so here it says Middle Paleolithic. Before Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, an extinct species of archaic human from the Pleistocene, sounds like Pleistocene, with its earliest occurrence about 2 million years ago. Several human species such as H. heidelbergensis and H. antecessor were formerly generally considered, and whatever information followed with that. Okay, so before Homo sapiens, Homo erectus had already spread throughout Africa and non-Arctic Eurasia by about 1 million years ago. The oldest known evidence for anatomically modern humans, AMH, terms used to distinguish Homo sapiens that are anatomically consistent with the range of phenotypes seen in contemporary humans from extinct archaic human remains. As of 2017, our fossils found at Jebel el-Hood, Morocco, dated about 360,000 years ago. So it's got here Africa, North Africa, Morocco, anatomically modern human remains of 8 individuals dated 300,000 years ago, 300,000 years old, making them the oldest known remains categorized as modern as of 2018. And then Neanderthal admixture coming out of Turkey. There is evidence for interbreeding between archaic and modern humans during the Middle Paleolithic and early Upper Paleolithic. The interbreeding happened in several independent events that included Neanderthals and hominoids, or human beings. Okay. So genetic evidence for early Homo sapiens admixture to Neanderthals in West Asia discovered in 2017. So that would verify what was found in the original ancient or very old manuscripts, Old Testament manuscripts in the sacred scribal old tongue or language, Lishana Artica Cyprea, or the language that God spoke to Adam and Eve and to the men at the Tower of Babel, of the Assyrian Aramaic or Aramaic, or from the Tav Asherit or Asheri, which is supposedly the older sister language of the Tav Ivri or Avri, or the original ancient very old Hebrew. Okay, here's the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Omo Kabish Formation, the Omo remains of modern humans found in 1967 near the Ethiopian Kabish Mountains, dated stratigraphically to 195 plus 5 Ka, may be related to Ledigararu. And plenty more here. Asia, West Asia, Israel. Fossil maxilla is apparently older than remains found at Skyhall and Quasquafzir. Layers dating from between 250,000 and 140,000 years ago in the same cave contain tools of the Levallois. Is that? Not too sure. A distinct type of stone napping developed around 250,000 to 300,000 years ago during the Middle Paleolithic period, part of the Mousterian stone tool industry. Okay, a type which could be put to date of the first migration even earlier if the tools can be associated with modern human jawbone finds. Okay, there's plenty more there. Upper Paleolithic, South America, hypothetical Pleistocene peopling of the Americas. Charcoal from the oldest layers yielded dates of 41,000 to 56,000 BP. Before present years or years present before. A time scale used mainly in archaeology, geology and other scientific disciplines to specify when events occurred relative to the origin of practical radiocarbon dating in the 1950s. And there's plenty more information there. Holocene. Paleolithic, Neolithic, and pre-modern human migration. And you have modern, age of sail, age of discovery, timeline of European exploration and polar exploration. And there's see also references. There's a lot there. External links, National Geographic, etc. Okay, so we went to look at this news report, earliest evidence of humans outside of Africa, by a Professor Zhao Yu Shu. Scientists say they've found the earliest known evidence of a human present outside Africa. Stone tools discovered in China suggest primitive humans or a close relative were in the region as early as 2.12 million years ago. They are about 270,000 years older than the previous earliest evidence, which consists of bones and tools from Dmanisi in Georgia. Is that Russia? The research by a Chinese-British team appears in the journal Nature. The stone artifacts were discovered at Shangqin on a plateau in northern China. They comprise different types of stone tools constructed for a variety of purposes. All show signs of having been used. Most were made of quartzite and quartz rock that probably came from the foothills of the Qinling Mountains, 5 to 10 kilometers to the south of the dig site, but we don't know for sure which species of human relative made them. And there's a map of sites where evidence of human presence has been found. Why does it matter? Humans left Africa at many times during their history. Living people outside Africa, for example, trace their origins to an exodus that occurred 60,000 years ago. But there has been no evidence of occupation by human relatives in Eurasia until the Dmanisi evidence at 1.8 million years ago. Writing in Nature, paleoanthropologist John Kappelman, who was not involved with the new study, commented the roughly 14,000 kilometre trek from Eastern Africa to Eastern Asia represents a range expansion of geometric proportions. Africa has traditionally been seen as the engine of human evolution, where key species arose before spreading out through the rest of the world. However, some scientists have proposed a more important role in this story for Asia. With these new finds, some researchers will wonder how much further back the human story goes in Asia. What prompted humans to leave Africa? Co-author Professor Robin Dennell from the University of Exeter, UK or United Kingdom, England, said he believes evidence from Ethiopia offers some clues. Early human relatives, hominins, learnt how to produce sharp stone flakes around 2.6 million years ago. That way they acquired a simple but effective toolkit that could strip meat off a carcass before they were chased off by bigger and stronger predators, e.g. lions, hyena. This opened up a new world for them, Professor Dennell told BBC News. He added, with those new skills, they were able to expand out of Africa into the grasslands and open woodlands of Asia in much the same type of environments as in East Africa. The Asian fauna at that point had never encountered a bipedal tool-using carnivorous ape before, and this, Professor Dennell suspected that hominins found it easy to acquire meat. The researchers found evidence for occupation of the plateau by ancient humans between 1.3 and 2.1 million years ago. Could we find even earlier evidence outside Africa? If our ancient relatives were in China by 2 million years ago, there must be earlier evidence in more westerly parts of Asia, closer to the exit point from Africa. Professor Robin Dennell explained, I think the hominin record in Asia could go back to 2.5 to 2.6 million years, around the time that hominins opened up a new niche by flaking stone. He said the discovery showed Asia was absolutely fundamental in human evolution. We are now moving beyond a Eurocentric view of human evolution in Eurasia. The Asian record for human evolution is proving to be as complex and fascinating as in Europe and Africa, said Professor Dennell. And he asked, did climate change have a role in this? Does this have anything to do with the Indonesian Hobbit? Homo floresiensis, dubbed the Hobbit, is a tiny extinct species of human that lived until about 12,000 years ago on the Indonesian island of Flores. One of the adults measured just 1.1 metre, 3.7 feet tall. Many scientists think the Hobbit is a diminutive form of Homo erectus, long thought to be the first human species to leave Africa. Under this scenario, H. erectus, or Homo erectus, arrived on Flores hundreds of thousands of years ago and shrank in size after becoming isolated there. Others point out that aspects of the Hobbit's anatomy look too primitive for Homo erectus to be the ancestor. They wonder whether the Hobbit's progenitor was an Australopithecine, an earlier and more ape-like relative that roamed Africa that has never been found outside the continent. Professor Robin Dennell said, my preference is that the makers of the 2.1 million-year-old artifacts at Shangchen were a primitive form of Homo, human, which is not very unlike an Australopithecine at that point in time. This discovery does lend some support to the possibility that H. floresiensis has a primitive Australopithecine type ancestor. Obviously, we need the skeletal evidence as well as an open mind. There's so much that we don't know, and the Shangchen evidence is just another piece in a very complex jigsaw. So it's possibly we're hobbits, but not like on Lord of the Rings. 1 to 2 million years ago, according to the associated evidence. And it's got first human ancestor report. First human ancestor came from Europe, not Africa. 7.2 million year old fossils indicate, okay, and this is what they reckon it looks like, an artist's impression, probably someone who, it's either correct or it's incorrect, right? Because they're like backing evolution. Yeah. Artist impressions of Graecopithecus. Scientists have proposed this could be the oldest hominin ever discovered. Okay. You can listen to the article. Shall we listen to it? If it works.
First human ancestor came from Europe, not Africa. 7.2 million-year-old fossils indicate the first hominid species, a line that eventually leads to humans, may have emerged in Europe 7.2 million years ago and not Africa, the most widely accepted starting point for our ancestors. An international team of scientists has presented 2 studies that suggest the divergence point between chimpanzees and humans took place in the eastern Mediterranean rather than East Africa. Their findings, published in PLOS I, are based on 2 fossils of the species Greikopithecus freibergii, which were discovered in Greece and Bulgaria and have now been dated to between 7.2 and 7.1 million years ago. Previously, scientists had thought hominids and chimps split between 7 and 5 million years ago, with the first in the hominin line emerging in Africa. But these fossils, scientists say, tell a different story about the onset of human evolution. Both fossils, a lower jaw and an upper premolar, were examined using state-of-the-art computer tomography, allowing the scientists to look at their internal structures. Their findings show the teeth are fused in a way that is characteristic of early humans, including Ardipithecus and Australopithecus, the latter of which the famous Lucy fossil belongs to. The jawbone also had dental root features that appear to belong to a pre-human rather than to an ancient chimp.
We have done a video, we believe, on Lucy. We had a National Geographic magazine or something like that around somewhere, and it said that Lucy was fake. It was a fraud. And there was another ancestor found, and they had the bones, etc., that was like 4 million years older than that. We don't know where that magazine is. It's around somewhere, but we would present it to you and what it said in there. Yeah, we found it possibly waiting in a waiting room somewhere, and we picked it up and found it interesting, so we walked off with it. Okay, we'll continue with this.
This raises the possibility that the fossils represent the oldest hominin ever discovered, and that the major splits in the hominid family occurred outside Africa, they wrote. Researchers say environmental changes caused the divergence and used geological analysis to reconstruct the conditions from the Sahara to the Mediterranean during this time. They showed that the desert would have spread far into southern Europe, creating a barrier between Africa and the locations where Greikopithecus was found. The study has been met with skepticism because the vast majority of fossil evidence appears to suggest our ancestors emerged in Africa and migrated outwards. James Cole, senior lecturer in archaeology at the University of Brighton, UK, tells Newsweek that while the authors are cautious in saying Greikopithecus is potentially the oldest known hominin, their conclusions are still bold. What they are definitely suggesting is that rather than the divergence point that eventually leads to us, the hominin route, being in Africa, they are strongly suggesting, in both papers, that it is the eastern Mediterranean landscape where that is happening, which is remarkable. It's certainly not impossible that this is the case. The rate we are finding out about our hominin ancestors in terms of their evolutionary story over the last 5 years has been absolutely phenomenal. What it probably shows us, if anything, is that we don't know an awful lot. Cole says that the studies show that there was a connected landmass between Africa and Europe, and that the desert between them created a barrier, dividing populations and causing a new species to emerge. But the fossilized hominin is not necessarily our earliest ancestor and may have separated from some other early species that would eventually go on to become Ardipithecus. If we just try to look at it with hominin dispersals in context, there have certainly been primates and hominin species moving in and out of Africa, and we tend to see the drawings of the arrows moving in one direction, but there's no reason why they can't be bidirectional, he says. The strength of the study is showing we've been very East African focused for the origin point, and that focus perhaps needs to be broadened a bit more so than we've been willing to do in the past. That's not to say East Africa or the continent isn't the origin point, but I think it's clearly demonstrated that there is a lot going on around elsewhere in the Middle East and Europe. For me personally, I think Africa is still a strong contender for the split between chimpanzees, bonobos, and whatever ends up with us, ancient hominins, but they are certainly putting forward a case in these 2 papers that is well worth archaeologists, paleoanthropologists, experts in the field. Looking again at the record and thinking of it, the African story does still stack up. In an email interview with Newsweek, study author Madeline Bulma says they do not doubt the presence of early hominins in Africa, but the oldest potential hominin has been found in Greece and Bulgaria. That is the fact we present. We not only provide the advanced hominin-like features of Greikopithecus and a very exact age, we importantly provide a totally new mechanism explaining the split of chimps and humans. We are calling it North Side Story. She says the barrier the desert would have created would have separated populations for at least 500 to 700,000 years. Wilma also says it is too easy to consider the specimens as just anomalies within the fossil record. I dismiss such views, she says, adding the next task will be to find more evidence to back up their findings. We will try to find new materials of Greipithecus. The chances are now quite good. Just a quick word from our sponsor.
New Zealand. The cost of living really is a crisis for children in poverty. Rising rent and household bills mean there's often nothing left for little tummies. 15% of Kiwi kids, that's 144,000, regularly go hungry. But if you can donate just $15 to Kids Can, together we can make sure children in poverty get the food they urgently need right now. Please donate today at 15for15.org.nz.
First human ancestor.
Yeah, interesting article there, and add on at the end. Yeah, it's pretty bad. New Zealand, like, there's a lot of families just going, they got too many kids, or they got to buy petrol to go to work to get the money to feed the kids and all this sort of stuff. But that problem was solved and so on. We generally just, if we come across people like that, we buy them some food, We can't feed all of them. Obviously, you could donate to Kids Can, right? But does it really go to those families? We don't know that. So yeah, it's easy for us to just directly give donations of food or whatever, Maybe pay someone's, if they got a small shopping cost or whatever, at the supermarket, pay it forward, because that's what happened with us. Someone paid ours a couple of times, out of the blue. Yeah, it's just thinking about your fellow man, etc., etc. Okay, charity begins at home, right? Okay, it's a lot of problems within your own country, etc. But it is nice to donate to the third world countries that are suffering and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so go look at this article. What are hominids? To define it, right? Hominids are the biological family of which humans are a member. Informally, they are known as the great apes and include 4 genera: humans, chimpanzee, gorillas, and orangutans. Hominids can be broken down into 2 subfamilies: Pongoni, which includes orangutans, Pongo, and Homini, which includes gorillas, chimps, Pan, and humans, and the extinct close relatives such as Neanderthal Homo, or Homo sapien. The definition of hominid has changed several times in the past. At one point it referred only to humans and our extinct close relatives, and this old definition sometimes persists today. Hominid means human-like. Hominids, especially humans, can be considered the most intelligent biological family on the planet. The products of human intelligence are ubiquitous and quite startling. The computer you're using, read this, for instance, while signs of intelligence in other animals is more subtle. At least one gorilla, Koko, has been taught to use a rudimentary form of sign language. So that makes a difference between us and these monkeys or apes. We can speak, they don't have the vocal cords, etc. to do so. Hominids have been around on Earth for about 7 million years. Around 6 million years ago, the evolutionary line which gave rise to humans separated from the chimpanzees. In order as of genetic relatedness to humans, chimps are closest, followed by gorillas, then orangutan. All hominids have at least 97% genetic similarity to modern humans. Hominids live in social groups, etc., etc. Okay, and this is the author or the writer here. Okay. Looking at the ancient, the original ancient Brita of the original ancient, very old sacred scribal language of the scriptures, the Old Testament, i.e. the language that God spoke to Adam and Eve, and supposedly the men at the Tower of Babel used to communicate with each other and build that tower. Translated into English by native-born Aramaic-speaking translator, filmmaker, Mesopotamian historian Victor N. Alexander. it speaks of Neanderthals, okay, being created before Adam and Eve. There's a difference there. They are supposed to be like created in the likeness of God, the image of God. They had his visage, his face, etc. Right? They had life, obviously. They had that life, breath of life. They had a soul. They had intelligence, etc. But they lacked the Spirit of God. Okay, so they could communicate, spend time with God, commune with Him, etc., etc. Walk and talk in the Spirit of God, right? So they apparently were told to multiply and increase. They had the same availability of herbs, fruits, etc. in the Garden of Eden, and they might have migrated towards the east somewhere, as it continually seems to hint at in the Brita, in the Aramaic, or Genesis in the English. And then Adam and Eve are made, or Adam is made from the dust of the earth, or the ground, or the dirt, in the likeness of God. He has God's, obviously looks like God, or the image of God, etc. But there's a difference between them, human beings, and these Neanderthals, being that they had the breath of life. They were animate. Before that they were inanimate, they became animate. So they had life, and they were walking around, walking and talking, and eating and stuff, just like these Neanderthals were eating, right? Eating all the fruit and veggies and all that sort of stuff in the Garden of Eden. But the difference was they had the Spirit of God, that Holy Spirit, so they could commune with God in the presence of God, etc., etc. So that was the subtle difference. And then later on, around about Genesis chapter 6 or something, humans are these sons of God, or these children of God, Seth's descendants. Okay. There's a difference between the children of God and the sons of God. Sons of God are supposed to be like the angels, the heavenly hosts, etc., whereas the children of God are human beings. This was a holy line, and then they left that because they saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, they were hot, so they chose whoever they wanted, right, and did as they pleased, and then man starts becoming evil, because supposedly the Neanderthals have intelligence, but they rely on their animal instinct, okay, and they hunt and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so they interbred with these daughters of men, right? Possibly Neanderthals, as science says. We are the hybrids of the ancestors inbreeding, interloping with these Neanderthals. So later on, they became giants, aliens. They're not little green men or ETs or anything, right? They just became strange creatures because the DNA, etc., they were too close, right? Being human beings, probably two different forms of human beings or beings, but they interloped, and then something went wrong there, right? So they come up with these strange creatures, giants, okay? Or someone in those days could have been 4'5" or 5'6" or something, and someone might have been like 6'6" or something, and they think, oh, that's a giant, or even taller, okay? Or they might have even been, according to the scientific and archaeological evidence, bones remains found, right? They might have actually been 10 feet tall, 11 feet tall, but they are like these strange creatures, hybrids, aliens, i.e. freaks, basically. So we don't get into this. Okay, languages evolve, we believe that, but we don't get into this thing of the Darwinism where there was one great ape and then it became as human. They don't believe in that crap, because then there wouldn't be. We're not too sure. We don't think that there would be a Neanderthal human connection, right? It would be a human interloping with, or intermarrying, or interbreeding with an ape, right? Well, that's just we don't get into that Darwinism stuff. Okay, each to his own, but we don't. Okay, we rather go with that in scriptures. Okay, the ancient Aramaic, the Brita, etc. That there were two types created, and eventually one interbred with the other, right? And there's problems because they're too closely related, blood-wise, DNA-wise. Okay. The only difference being they didn't have that Spirit of God, that Holy Spirit in them. So they had a soul, but they didn't have that Ruach HaKodesh or Holy Spirit. So we're going back to this one here, and we're going to listen to it some more. Okay, listen to it, sorry.
Good evening. Welcome to tonight's talk. The presentation you're about to hear stems from a question that I submitted last September to tonight's guest speaker. As some of you are already aware, there has been considerable debate within various faith communities over whether traditional Christian doctrine and polygenism are mutually compatible. And this spirited debate has received much attention on the radio and in various newspapers. Polygenism is the view that not all human persons can be traced back to one historical man, Adam, and one historical woman, Eve. Many believers hold that polygenism is not fully compatible with Christian doctrine. Nevertheless, more than a few professional scientists, including believing scientists, hold that the available evidence strongly favors polygenism. For many Christians, this is a matter of fundamental importance, an issue having deep theological implications. Is this a case of real conflict between Christian faith and scientific reason? Or is there a way to overcome what many perceive to be a real conflict between human science and divine revelation? Our guest speaker will attempt to answer that question, and the presentation will be followed by a Q&A period. Father Nicanor Giorgio Austracio is Associate Professor of Biology at Providence College. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Engineering, Bioengineering, from the University of Pennsylvania, a doctorate in Biology from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and a Bachelor of Sacred Theology and a Licentiate in Sacred Theology, both from the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. Father has also served as Fellow of the International Human Frontier Science Program for the Ludwig Institute for Cancer Research at the University College of London. The subject for his research and published work range from the life cycle of yeast to bioethics to moral theology. His most recent work is a book entitled Biomedicine and Beatitude, An Introduction to Catholic Bioethics, published in December 2011 by the Catholic University of America Press. Please join me in welcoming Father Austracio.
Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction and the kind invitation to travel here to Nashville to visit your wonderful institution. Special thanks to my sisters for the invitation to come and join with them. I'm especially grateful for that introduction, but as I tell my students, the most important thing about me is I'm a priest. And today I would like to speak from that perspective. I'm a priest who in the providence of God happens to be a biologist. And I would like to invite you into this conversation. How are we going to talk about Adam and Eve today in light of biology? But before we do that, I would like to do what my students and I do every time we start, and we have to start with a prayer. And this is the prayer that my students and I basically pray every time. And there's a very funny story about this. When I first joined Providence College's faculty 7 years ago, I decided that I would start my classes with a prayer. And so I took the prayer of my brother, our brother, St. Thomas Aquinas, and this prayer is an incredibly long prayer, and if you prayed the whole thing, half the period would be over. And so I decided that I would compact the prayer, and this is the prayer. And we did it the first semester, and I decided to continue this because I heard the story that a couple of my freshmen, so my favorite class is Bio 103, which is the introduction to general biology, and a couple of my freshmen turned up in the ER of the local hospital, and they discovered that, well, they needed to pray, and they weren't quite sure what to pray, so they decided to pray this prayer, a prayer before study, and I heard through the grapevine, they were wondering if God would understand. And I said, yes, God would understand. And so ever since then, I have prayed this prayer with my students at every time. So let's begin. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. O God, creator of all things, true source of light and wisdom, graciously let a ray of your light penetrate the darkness of my understanding. Give me a keen intellect, a retentive memory, and the ability to grasp things correctly and fundamentally. Give me the talent of being exact in my explanations, and the ability to express myself with earnest and charm. I have the beginning to direct my progress and perfect my work. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the biology. So a lot of you hopefully are aware of the story of Adam and Eve in the theology. So I'm going to begin by just talking about what has science told us about the historicity, the origins of our species. And then I'm going to briefly go through some of the Holy Scripture to highlight points in the Holy Scripture that deal with Adam and Eve. And then I'm going to focus on what the Catholic Church has taught and how she is struggling with this question and discerning with the help of the Holy Spirit how to properly understand this theological point. And then I'm going to actually propose one way of reconciling church teaching with these scientific findings. So that it's going to be a symphony basically in 4 movements. So I'm going to begin with the first part. What can human genomic science tell us about the origins of our species? And so I'm assuming that not all of you here are biologists. Some of you, the last biology class was ancient of days. So what I'm going to do is just kind of review DNA and genomes and what is that and what can we do with all that information. So the genome consists of all the genetic information, and if here's a kid, if you take his cells, what you end up doing is there are 2 parts of the human genome. The majority of the DNA, the majority of the genetic information is found in the nucleus. And the nucleus, as I tell my freshmen, that's headquarters. That's the control room for the cell. It tells the cell pretty much what to do and what to make. There's also the mitochondria, and the mitochondria are the powerhouse. It's the energy source for the cell. And there is a very small mitochondrial genome, and that's going to come up a little bit later. I'm just going to point that out to you, that there's a mitochondrial genome. And what's unique about this is that you only inherit your mitochondria from your mom. So when you go to your nuclear genome, half of this genome is from your mom, half is from dad. But when it comes to the mitochondrial genome, you only get it from your mom. So keep that in mind. We're going to have to go back to that later in this lecture. So if we talk about the genome itself, you have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and this is a nice colorized version of that. And here you've got a simple chromosome. Now it turns out when I was a kid, and I loved biology when I was a kid, I assumed that this was one chromosome. It actually turns out that this is 2 copies of a chromosome. You've got 1 copy on this side and another copy on the other side. And they're joined here at the center, and eventually that center is going to break. one of the strands is going to go to one daughter cell, and the other is going to go to the other daughter cell. So in the process of cell division, when one cell becomes two cells, they split up their genomes into two. Now, if you take this chromosome and you just, try to enlarge it, you get bigger and bigger, what you see is that here we start off, here's the cell, and you've got your chromosome. If you just keep looking at it microscopically, what you end up is you have your world-famous double helix. And so the chromosome is one gigantic strand, one incredibly long strand of DNA. And our genome is numbered in such a way that chromosome 1 is the longest, the largest, going down to chromosome 21 and 22, which are really, really, really teeny. And then you have the X and the Y, and they're special in so many different ways. But what we're going to focus just generically on a chromosome. And so basically I want you to think about that. The genome is really just 23 pairs of long DNA strands. And if you look at a DNA strand, if you look at DNA, and what you see, this is DNA. This is actually the gene that my students and I study. This is the yeast gene Bax inhibitor. We discovered this gene 3 years ago, and we've been working on it. It's involved in cell suicide, and if you get rid of it, the cell doesn't die properly. And this is actually important because cancer cells don't die, and they don't commit suicide when they should. And in fact, the human version of this gene has been implicated in breast cancer, in brain cancer, and several other cancers. And so my students and I are working out, we're trying to figure out why don't cells die when they lack this gene? Or why does this gene, what does this gene do with regards to cell death? But for now, what I want you to see is that this piece of DNA is just a string of A, T, G's, and C's. There are 4 kinds of molecules, and each one of these molecules is indicated by a letter, and there are 4 letters, G, A, T, and C. And you can imagine the human genome is made up of 3 billion of these letters. And so they're just arranged. And the first semester of Introduction to Biology is really how do you decipher that code? That's the first semester of molecular biology is how do you get from this to Dr. Smart? Right? Because we have to get from here to here. And that, to me, that's the most awesome thing about biology, is how you get from there to there. And trying to read that code is first semester freshman biology. But the take-home message is, it's a text. You can see it, you can look at it as a text of 4 letters, just repeating in particular order. So now what you can do is, you can compare and contrast genomes, and you can determine the relationships among them. So the analogy I tell my students is the following, right? Think about 10 final exams. So this is a college. Let's say you're a professor, you get 10 final exams, and some of them have similar answers. Now what is your immediate conclusion? What is it? Someone cheated. Now when we say someone cheated, what we mean is 2 exams have a common origin. Do you see how that is? So if I copy your exam, then my exam has a common origin with your exam, the stuff that's in your head. And this is a no-no in school, because we're evaluated for what's in our head, not in other people's head. And so you can see that just like you can use reason to figure out, let's say you've got 10 exams. Some are more closely related to each other than to others. And now the professor's got to figure out who wrote the original exam. Now you can do that. You can sit there and figure out, based upon these 10 exams and how similar or how different they are, who was the original exam. And then you can figure out who copied from whom, and then you can check it on Facebook to see if there's a correlation, right? Because hopefully there are friends in there. And so this is like the other data. So what biologists do is we do the same thing. We take genomes and we can compare them. And we can say, you see, this one has CAATC. There's CAATC. That has a C, but this one has a T, and that one has a G. That one has an A. But you can see that these two genomes from two different animals are very similar. There are things about them that look like they have been copied. And so we posit, we hypothesize that these two genomes come from a common ancestor, a common genome. And so we are able, in the same way that a professor is able to trace back who copied from whom, we are able to trace the actual relationships between genomes. We can say these two genomes are more closely related to each other than these two to the third. And you can see that we're not using rocket science. We're using common sense. And this is what I want to impress upon you. The science that is being used here is not unlike typical reasoning powers that you and I use in everyday life. A lot of people think that science, especially genomic science, is just so weird and so bizarre that I can ignore it. And I can just somehow say that the scientists are messed up. And I've had people tell me that. But what I wanted to impress upon you is that we're using reason, the reason that God gave us, to look at a particular question. And the question is, given all these genomes, all these exams, how are they related to each other? And who copied from whom? So we say similar genomes have a common historical origin. So more closely related genomes have a more recent common ancestor. So if our exams are more closely related, it's likely that we had a common exam that we copied from. Now, scripture scholars do this in scripture studies all the time. You do this with any text. So the reasoning process that I'm discussing here is not something atypical. We're basically using human reason. So the second principle is this. The differences between the genomes can be used to estimate the historical time since their divergence. What does that mean in English? If I have 10 exams, and 2 of these exams have 2 questions in common, but 8 questions are relatively different, then I would say that it is likely that the copying that happened much earlier in the copying process. And so I can, as compared to 2 exams that have 8 questions in common versus the one with 2 questions in common. And so I can trace who copied whom and who came first. And so I can trace the history and relationships of genomes. And that's what people do. So you have a situation where here you have the hominid evolutionary lineage. Hominid is just scientific geeky name for primates. Okay? See? You all know that. Monkeys. So there we are, the rational monkey. And then there's Pan, that's chimpanzee, and then you have gorilla. Now, the way I want you to see that this is an evolutionary tree where the names are today, and as you move back down the tree, you go back in history. So chimpanzees and human beings have a common origin that is more recent than the common origin between gorillas, chimpanzees, and human beings. So we are more closely related to chimpanzees than we are related to gorillas. That's what what's called a phylogenetic tree, tells us. Now we can go through these trees. So this is the hominid. The hominids are basically the primates. And then we go to hominins, and hominins are human-related species. So here you saw the original tree. This is actually, and we're dealing here with millions of years. So the history between, the divergence between humans and chimpanzees has been dated to something like the order of 3 million years. Now as we get closer, as we focus in on humans, what you see is about 1 million years ago, you have modern humans, this is today, 25,000 years ago, which is not that long when it comes to evolutionary history, right? You have the Neanderthals And then you have this other ancient hominin species called the Denisovans. They were just discovered in the last 5 years. And so what happens is you have these ancient human-like species, and you have these divergences. And then if you go down to us, this is us. So you have archaic humans, more about that in a few minutes. And then you see you have Africans, European, Asians, and Melanesians. So these are the folks in Australia. We're not talking about the descendants of the English or the Irish. We're talking about the original native peoples who colonized Australia and the South Pacific many, many years ago. And so what you have is you have this increasing complexity, well, actually, detail with regards to the history of our species. Now, notice that the African people, the European people, the Asian people, the Melanesian people have a common origin, the archaic humans. And so I need to go over how we know that. How do we know that all human beings are descended from a common population? So what you do there is, I'm going to go through the thinking first, all right? So imagine here you have a human being with a genetic marker, and we're just going to say we're going to mark his DNA, let's just say with a red dot. That's all. Now, technically, this is a single nuclear polymorphism, but we don't need to go into that. We just say you get a fill paint, and I can paint your DNA. I'm going to paint it red. Now, what ends up happening is when he has kids, all of his kids are going to have the red dot. You see that? Because they inherit the red dot from dad. Now, as you go through, what happens is this kid inherits the red dot, but he, say, several generations later, he acquires a secondary mutation in his own DNA. It's blue dot. Now, his brother doesn't have blue dot. He has blue dot. None of his cousins have blue dot, but let's say a distant cousin has purple dot. Now, what happens, you see, is in the course of history, you get a situation where people start to inherit different colors. So now, let's just say I look at this person. He's got red dot, blue dot, and green dot. Now notice, all the human beings down here have red dot. So I know that red is the oldest marker for the DNA line, because every single one has red. That's because they have a common ancestor way, way back that has red. Now if you look at yellow, you notice is only one generation old. Purple is now several generations back. And so what I can do is, I can tell that these two people right here are more closely related to each other than this person is to that person. Now you can do it this way. This is the person from Australia. This is the person from Indonesia. This is the person from Africa. This is the person from from South America. And what you can do, and what scientists have done, is they have gone and sampled genomes from all over the planet. And they've compared them, and they've noticed that some people, especially those who live close to each other, share common markers. So these two people here are red and, I don't know what color that is. Aqua, very good. So one of the great things about the digital age is I've discovered all these different names for colors. Now this is very important. So for yesterday, when I celebrated the Holy Mass at the Carmel in Barrington, Rhode Island, I pointed out to the people of God that my vestments were not pink. They are rose. You see, so colors are important, and it turns out it's rose because it commemorates the stational church in Lent in Rome, where the Holy Father yesterday would have blessed the roses. In ancient days of past, the Holy Father would bless roses that he would give to kings and princes. And in fact, if you go to the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, you will see the rose that our Holy Father Benedict XVI gave to that church. And those roses are blessed on Lautare Sunday, which is why it's always rose. It is not pink. Moving back here to aqua, what you see is that you can now basically come up with a historical tree of all the human beings. And so every single human being that we have ever done this with has red. And so we know that all of us have a common origin way back in time. And what we can then do is we can then figure out what is red. And red, and this is used for mitochondrial DNA, but so let's just say these numbers indicate the coloring of your DNA. And it turns out that every single human being has the L color. And so the L color, the L haplotype is the technical term, is the oldest one, and it is found primarily in Africa. And what we have worked out is that we started off way back here in Africa, and all 7 billion of us are descended from a population way back here in Africa. And our genomes are similar enough to know that we're descended from the same group. And this is very important. We'll talk about now, is it the same group or the same person, or is there necessarily a difference between the two? So all of us have a common origin in East Africa. And so the first scientific consensus, this is pretty much a consensus, I'd say every scientist pretty much holds to this, is that we have a common origin 115,000 years ago in Eastern Africa, and they dispersed from Africa about 50,000 years ago. And they dispersed across what is called, right here, what is the Red Sea. Basically, they crossed over that. There was a path that went north, a path that went down to Australia, and then a path through Asia, across the Bering Strait, and down into North and South America. Now, we're not talking, we're not talking about the colonial period. We're dealing here with thousands and thousands of years ago. These are the native peoples of these lands. I have to bring this out because some people will say, but Father, I know my family came over. And I'm like, I know, but we're not talking about your family per se. All right? Your family is way back here. And so what we can do now is we can actually take DNA and look at history. So this is actually my DNA. So I happen to be at a function sitting next to someone who was working for National Geographic on the National Genographic Project, where you send in your DNA and they have your DNA typed. So I sent my DNA in. It's fun. And she was like, you want to do it? I'm like, I'm a biologist. Of course. So this is my DNA. So this is my Y chromosome. Now, the Y chromosome, just for those of you who may not know this, is what makes a guy a guy. Right? And as I explain to my students, I always ask them, why does the Savior of the world have to be a guy? Why is Jesus a guy? You know, I'm teaching science and religion, and this came up a couple of weeks ago, and they're like, never thought about it. And I said, well, because in biology, we know of many circumstances where females can give rise to females without fertilization. It's called Parthenogenesis. Aphids are basically all female. And females give rise to females. So, had the Mother of God had a daughter, it would have been tough, but you could have imagined that there could have been a natural cause. But and so I say, when you talk about the mystery of the incarnation, if you wanted to reduce it biologically, it can be reduced to this. Where did Jesus' Y chromosome come from? They go, wow, that's the incarnation. I go, well, it's much more than that, right? It's much more than that, as we will remember next week at the Solemnity of the Annunciation. It's much more than that, but from a biospeak, it's where does the Y chromosome come from? And this is my Y chromosome, and these are the markers. And what happens is, so they were able to take my markers, and this is my family's heritage. So these are the little painted dots on my chromosomes, M89, M9, M2114. And so, as you can tell, I'm not Caucasian. And so it makes sense that my family comes from basically what we now call modern China. And that's home for me right there. And so in the prehistoric times, most of the people of Asia are descended from the original population that populated Africa and many of Asia, and many of us who are of Chinese or Asian origin from this part of the world have these markers on our Y chromosomes. And so that's a way today how you can figure out your history. You see, this is not just something about what happened way back. One of my brothers, I won't name him, got really excited about this because he had heard that he was descended from the Vikings. Well, this is a way you can check. So he saved up his stipend and he sent his DNA, and it turned out he's descended from agrarian farmers from Central Europe. He was like, it's not as cool as Vikings. So, and the Vikings have their own particular genetic characteristics. So you can actually tell if you are descended from Vikings or from agrarian farmers from Central Africa, Central Europe. So, I mean, I just brought this up to see how this genomic science tells us something not about yesterday. It can also tell us something about who you are, who we are as a species. Now, what about Mitochondrial Eve? Now, you might have heard about Mitochondrial Eve. This was like a big thing about 20 years ago. It turns out that, as I mentioned to you, we inherit our mitochondria only from our mothers. And it turns out that we are descended, so if you do that, we are all descended from a single female who lived 200,000 to 150,000 years ago. Now, a lot of people go, wow, this must be Eve. Right? Because we are all descended from a single female. That's very important. When you get down to it, all 7 billion of us have our mitochondrial DNA from this woman. But what I'm going to try to tell you is that to explain nuclear genomic diversity, remember there's DNA from the mitochondria and that you inherit only from your mom, and then there's DNA from the nucleus, which you inherit from your dad and your mom. We know that she was not the only woman alive at the time. Now you're going to go, wow, this is weird. How can there be we're all descended from a single female, but she was not the only woman. Well, look at the picture. So this is that single female, and these colors are other females who lived contemporaneously with her. What you see is that this female here doesn't have any children. So her line dies. The one here on the far left, she has a single daughter. Now her daughter doesn't have a daughter, doesn't have children, so she dies. So that line dies. Now this one in pink here, her generation goes down 3 generations, but eventually her generation dies. And you can tell that over time, with enough time, what ends up happening is one single woman's genetic diversity took over the rest of the population. And as you'll see, this is not an accident. Let me explain to you how that works. All right? So here are beagle dogs. Now, does this dog pedigree make sense? Of course. Here are the 2 beagles, mommy beagle and daddy beagle. And I've got 3 beagles, right? But now, take a look at this. Here. Does this make sense to you? No. You know, because this one is so different from these 2 that basically I know that there have to be at least 2 pairs of parents to explain this. Do you understand how we're working back? So now the question is this. Given the 7 billion people today and the 150,000 years, how many mating pairs do you need to have way back there to explain the diversity we see today? You see the thinking that went on there? It's like that beagle. If I know there are 2 beagles and a Dalmatian, I know there can't be one single pair because it cannot explain the diversity of breeds that I see today. And so what happens today is we know that there had to have been between 1,000 to 2,000 mating pairs in a small geographic area from 70,000 to 50,000 years ago. Now, also amazing, though, is that about 74,000 years ago, there was a super eruption. Now, you've probably never heard of Toba. Toba was the most recent super eruption. Now, to give you a sense, here is Mount St. Helens. We're going to name that eruption, we're just going to give a value of 1. Here is Vesuvius. Now, Vesuvius is the volcanic explosion that leveled Pompeii. 70,000 years ago, we know that there was a supervolcano in Toba that exploded that was 2,800 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens. And what happened is, this explosion was so huge that it led to large-scale deforestations of India with an instant ice age lasting about 2,000 years. So there was so much soot that was released into the atmosphere that it got cold by 28 degrees overnight. And that lasted for 2,000 years. And what biologists think happened is that during that 2,000 years, well, imagine living up in Wyoming without any clothes on for 2,000 years. Eventually, some of you are going to die. And so the human population undergoes what is called a bottleneck. A lot of people die. And you end up with a small population in Africa. That's the current thinking of this. So now the third scientific consensus is that, remember the Neanderthals and the Denisovans? Well, it turns out that if you are either French, Han, that's Chinese, Melanesian, 4% of your genome is derived from the Neanderthals. So they were able to sequence the Neanderthal genome and your genome, and there was enough so it looks like we copied from each other. Now it turns out that the copying was minimal. It's only 44%. So the assumption that the Neanderthals, it was basically a run and grab. Like you had Neanderthal males would like grab a human female, mate with her, and she'd go back. And there would be interbreeding. And there was just enough that 4% of basically non-African. So if you look at the African DNA, they don't have any Neanderthals in them. But if you are basically French, Han, Melanesian, you have some DNA from the Neanderthals, and if you're Melanesian, if you're from Australia, you have some DNA not only from the Neanderthals, from the Denisovans. Now, the final scientific thing is, this is disputed, but most people believe this. If you look at anatomically modern humans, so 150,000 to 100,000 years ago, people looked like we are. Like they look like how we look. But behaviorally modern humans only appear 50,000 years ago. This is tool making, sophisticated weaponry, sculpture, cave painting, body ornaments. It appears only 50,000. So people call this, why did we go, what happened in this 50,000 years that made anatomically modern humans behaviorally modern? And there's an explanation. We think it's a genetic mutation that facilitates the acquisition of language. So prior to 50,000 years ago, the human beings looked like human beings, but we didn't have the ability to speak. We didn't have the ability to have culture. Okay? All right. So that was the science. Most of what we're going to talk about is there. And I'm going to go quickly through basically the Holy Scriptures and then the Church's teaching and close with a synthesis. So what does Holy Scripture say about Adam and Eve? So if you go here, of course, you go to Genesis, the second chapter of Genesis, and we talk, all of us know, hopefully, about the creation of Adam and Eve. And the Lord makes Adam first, and then Eve from a rib. Striking it. At MIT, I met a colleague from the South. So from the Bible Belt area. I'm not sure if she was from the Buckle or from other parts of the belt. But she actually, she was absolutely convinced that Adam had one less rib, so males had one less rib than females. And so she was very troubled when she saw x-rays, and she discovered that human beings have the same number of ribs. Now, it's a very important thing to see that many, many people understand Genesis absolutely literally. And so, as I bring this out and I talk about it, I'm incredibly sensitive to people are coming to this question from different places. But, and so this is a text talking about the origins of Adam and Eve. Now, it's interesting that unlike the creation narratives, the 7 days, the 6 days, that Hexameron, the Lord rested on the seventh day, there are references in the New Testament to Adam. And basically the idea here is that Jesus is the new Adam. And here you have an icon of the Lord risen, basically bringing Adam out of limbo. And there's, I don't know if there's a very famous poem, very, very appropriate for today. On Holy Saturday, the Lord descends into limbo. And there's a poem, I should have brought it, where he meets his foster father. And the poem is how he comes, and of course Limbo is waiting, and they're waiting because they know the Lord is coming, and Joseph is waiting. What's the first question that he asks the Savior? How is your mother? Isn't that beautiful? So you have that here. I mean, that's the image that in this poem it is Adam and Eve who welcome the Lord into limbo because they've been waiting their whole lives. Now, I want to raise a couple of things people might be aware. If you go to the story of Cain in Genesis 4, what happens is you have a reference. So Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and he built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. Now, this has raised problems over the last 2,000 years, because a lot of scholars and theologians have said, well, where did all these people come from to build a city? Remember, Adam and Eve had sons, Cain and Abel. Now, Cain goes off and builds a city. Like, where are these other people from? So there's actually a tradition in the Catholic tradition has this notion of Pre-Adamites. And these are people who pre-existed Adam. So I want you to understand that this discussion is much more ancient than you think. The notion of how do we explain the origins of Adam and Eve. You go to Genesis 6, the Nephilim. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown. Who are these? Who are the Nephilim? So these are, the Holy Scriptures records a group of people who would mate with human women. And these were the giants. I wonder, is this an ancient memory of the Neanderthals? I just throw that out there, right? I throw that out there. We know that the Neanderthals bred with our species. Could this have been an ancient memory? So that's basically where Scripture leaves us. Oops. So we've got to go to where the church is. And where is the church? The church begins, I'm going to start with 1950 Humani Generis, and this is, for the faithful cannot embrace that opinion which maintains that either after Adam there existed on this earth through men who did not take their origin through natural generation from him as from the first parent of all, or that Adam represents a certain number of first parents. So this is 1950, this is 62 years ago, Humani Generis, paragraph 37. It's actually the most authoritative statement that the Catholic Church has had on this question. Now, a lot of people don't go to the next sentence. Now, it is in no way apparent how such an opinion can be reconciled with what the sources of revealed truths propose with regard to original sin. So the reason why the faithful cannot embrace this opinion is because the church in 1950 did not know how you could reconcile a notion of polygenism with the church's understanding of original sin, which is why we need to reflect upon what the church teaches with regards to original sin. Now, this is Pope Paul VI. We are going 16 years into the future, right? you have the Holy Father again talking about Adam and Eve, and you notice that the focus again is on original sin. Which start from the presupposition of polygenism, which is not proved, and deny more or less clearly that the sin which has been such an abundant source of evils for mankind has consisted above all in the disobedience which Adam, the first man, and the figure of the future Adam committed at the beginning of history. So the church is very clear. What is most important in this discussion is the theological doctrine surrounding original sin. Now, if we move to the catechism, what happens is the church acknowledges that science has a role to play in the origins of our species. Now, we get to several statements on how you deal with original sin and how you deal with the reading of the first accounts of Genesis. So here you go. The biblical account expresses this reality in symbolic language. So it's already important to understand that for the Catholic, there are parts of Genesis that should be read symbolically. The question, of course, is which parts, right? Now, the church, interpreting the symbolism of biblical language in an authentic way, teaches that our first parents, Adam and Eve, were constituted in an original state of holiness and justice. And then, notice, the account of the fall in Genesis 3 uses figurative language, but affirms a primeval event. So, you have history, but you have literature. You have both coming together, and trying to discern how they come together is the challenge of faith and reason. By his sin, the first man loses original holiness, not only for himself and for all his descendants. And very important, we are therefore, all the descendants are deprived of original holiness and justice, and this is called original sin. So this, in a sense, gives you what we're working with. Now here you have Blessed John Paul II in 1996. He brings up Humani Generis in 1950. He talks about there is no conflict between evolution and the doctrine of the faith. This is something I just have to emphasize over and over again. For the Catholic, there is no conflict between evolutionary thought and our faith, the faith of the gospel, as long as several things are held. And these are the several things, right? First, the origin of the human body comes through living matter which existed previously. The spiritual soul is created directly by God. This is one of the things that we must hold as we try to bring these two together. Now I'm just going to, this is very, very controversial. The Holy Father then says, evolution is more than a hypothesis. And people are like, well, what does that mean? I'm like, what is a hypothesis? That's science and religion. I mean, that's another lecture. But I just wanted to point out that for the Holy Father, there is no need to reject evolution if you are able to work with faith and reason to bring it together. Now, this is now going to 2004. This is the International Theological Commission, chaired at the time by our now Holy Father Benedict XVI. Now, I want you to see where the church is moving. So in 2004, you see that the church in one of her documents says that the human species starts off in Africa in a humanoid population of common genetic lineage. So right away there's already a hint of a common genetic population. And in that same document, Catholic theology affirms that the emergence of that first members of the human species. Now notice it says, whether as individuals or in populations. So the church is open. The church is open to an account that recognizes populations of people as the origin of our species. But what's important is that it represents an event that is not of pure natural explanation, but has to be appropriately be attributed to divine intervention. So how, in the last 5 minutes, how do you reconcile it? I'm just going to propose. First thing is we have to say that you have to try to reconcile it. There are people who believe that we do not have to work at this. You can have science and you have faith and they're separate. but that is not the Catholic Church, right? So here, faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. Now, for the Dominican, this brings tears. This is the Dominican life, right? This is our life. This defines our life. I study and I pray. And both together, with the grace of God, will lead you to the contemplation of truth. And this, of course, is the opening line of Fides et Ratio. And so I have to affirm that before we even jump into trying to bring it together. This is something that God is calling us to do. Second, right? This is the catechism again. It's important to see that science, research, if it does not override moral laws, can never conflict with the faith. Now, I bring this up because I had friends at MIT when I was in graduate school. When we would talk about evolution, I would say, what about the fossils? And they'd say, well, Satan put the fossils in the ground because he wanted to lead you astray. Now, it's striking because once you hold to that, science becomes incredibly hard to do because you're not quite sure if it's Satan's work. Right? And so, especially as Dominicans, we have to affirm that creation is wonderful. Creation is awesome. It is good. And God leads us to himself and to our glorification through creation. I mean, the Summa is all about how God creates and it goes forth and we return to him. And so I have to say this once again just to remind you that science, if it is done contemplatively, hopefully, if it's there to look for truth, should not conflict. So we have that reassurance that somehow it fits. We might not be able to put it together, but somehow it fits. Now, one of the things I have to point out is that we have to talk about scientific findings. Are they trustworthy? Now, yesterday on the plane, I was reading the Summa. I love the Summa. And I was reading on so there's a question at the end of the Prima Pars where our brother Thomas Aquinas looks at where is Eden? So he uses the best science of his day. It's really cool to read. It's very comforting for me as a biologist because he will say, well, it's probably near the equator because the equator is the most moderate. But then he says, but there are some people who say that it's way too hot because if the sun goes right above you, it will burn you to death. So if you look at you see he's dealing with the best science of his day to try to figure out where Eden is. It's in Africa. Basically, based on the genomic research, if you see Eden as that place where we as a species were born, it was in Africa. So, but you notice he had to use his science, and well, we know today that people living in the equator are not burnt up. He did at that time, 800 years ago. So we have to ask, are the scientific findings that I talked to, are they trustworthy? Are they believable? And all I can tell you is this. This is a principle in science, right? As the evidence mounts in favor of a hypothesis, especially what we call convergent data from independent laboratories using different techniques and methods, then it becomes increasingly unlikely that rival hypotheses are true. You see, the story I gave you is dependent not upon one lab, it's dependent upon hundreds of labs working all over the planet using different techniques and different approaches to look at the question. They all come to one general picture. And so as a biologist, that's why we would say it's reasonable. And we know this common sense, right? So if you are a juror on a member of a jury, and you have 12 witnesses who tell you the same thing about what happened at the accident, it is likely you will believe that's the truth. Especially if no one contradicts them. You go, Well, 12 people seeing the same thing, it's very likely to be true. That's the same common sense logic we're using. We have so many people all over the planet doing so many different things, looking at the same question, coming to the same answer, that it's likely that this explanation is the true one. So then how do you do it? What you have to do is you have to ask the question, this is the last bit, is this. Well, which theological doctrines have to be reconciled? And I would tell you it has to deal with original sin. We have to focus on the church's teaching on original sin. And this is really what we have to talk about. The loss of original holiness and justice, and the transmission of this loss through human nature, which we call original sin. Now there's one thing that I also have to point out. The reason why the New Testament refers to Adam is because the Lord, the Savior of the world, is the new Adam. He assumes our common human nature and then redeems it, which is why we have to affirm a common human nature. Now, I was talking at lunch today. A lot of people assume that monogeneism is something that we've held for many generations. It turned out, at the turn of the 20th century in the South, there was a movement to go towards polygenism. Do you know why? Because there were people who wanted to argue that Africans were descended from people other than Adam and Eve. And they wanted to use that account to justify the difference between whites and blacks. One of the things that the scripture is very, very clear on is we are all the same stock. And there have been movements over history to try to deny that for one reason or the other. But theologically, we affirm that we are the same stock because it is that stock, if you are that is redeemed. If my nature is not the nature that my Savior redeemed, that undermines my certitude that I am redeemed. You understand? There is something profoundly important in affirming that the Lord assumed the nature that He did, our nature, so that we would be able to participate in His nature, which is divine, so that we, as they say, we can be like God. Isn't that amazing? Woo! I can't wait. So now I'm just going to say that these are the things that we need to be able to hold together. He created the human species as rational creatures at a particular moment in history, in a state of innocence and original justice. All of these prehistoric humans shared a common human rational nature. He is immediately responsible for the creation of every human soul. At some moment in history, all of them fell. They lost the preternatural gifts of infused knowledge, loving obedience, spontaneous virtue in the absence of suffering and death because of a singular act of disobedience. This state of original sin was then transmitted to all future human beings by propagation and not by imitation. This is the Council of Trent. And then this common human nature would be assumed and redeemed by the Savior of the world. Basically, that is what we have to hold. Now, how do we put that together? And this is my last slide. I'm going to propose one scenario. There are numerous ways. This is one way, right? Hominins evolved into archaic humans that are anatomically modern about 150,000 to 100,000 years ago. At a single moment in time, and I say after the Toba super eruption. So remember, the population, we're nearly, in fact, people say, we nearly went extinct because the population was so small. God infuses a small population of these hominins with a spiritual soul. They become rational animals. And I say, is that the reason why there's a great leap forward? Is there a reason why there's 100,000 years of the absence of culture? Because really what happens is the soul had to come for culture to appear. Adam is a member, possibly the tribe leader, and my students love to argue about how we're all going to put this together. He and his wife disobeyed the Lord in some way, leading the rest of the tribe to do the same. So the whole population falls. And then the descendants would migrate and eventually colonize the planet. We are here. We're all descended from that. See, that is a proposition. of a way to try to bring these two together. So I'm going to end. I've got to end. The first is, this is my lab at Providence College. I told them I'd put their picture in. We study programmed cell death, cell suicide, so they're the Dead Yeast Society, because all they do is kill yeast in cool and interesting ways. And this is the lab mascot. This is Hermit. Long story for why he's there, but I have some incredible students. And the great thing about doing research with my students is we can run the polyacrylamide gel the same time we're talking about the brothers Karamazov. You know, it's because they all have to take Civ, regardless of their major. So all my biology students have read the tradition. Now, some of them hate Civ because they can't imagine why they have to read Dante if they want to be a doctor. And I tell them, because one day you're going to help someone to die. And at that point, it's more about being a human being than being a doctor that's important. And then they go, really? I say, wait, you come back in 15 years. And I say, if you know Dante, you'll be able to talk to that soul. You can talk as much cancer. She's not going to listen to you. She wants to talk about Paradiso. And you have to be able to talk about that. So during the summers, I run the lab during the summer. So during the year, they do their research. Like this afternoon, they're like, Father, where are you? I'm in Nashville. Can we Skype? So they do research. And so wherever I am in the world, if they have a question, we Skype. So I can't imagine doing this without Skype. But this is my apostolate. So Father Hyacinth Marie Cordell is one of my brothers. He's a newly ordained priest. And we've been talking about this for 5 years. He entered the order. He didn't believe in evolution. And so we just talked and talked and talked and talked and talked. Now, I was a priest when he entered, so talking to a student brother is not as easy. So we would just talk and come, and when the community would gather, we'd sit at a table and he just asked him. He wrote, before he was ordained to the holy priesthood, he wrote a 30-page paper on the question. And he just summarized a lot of our arguments. So, and he is now assigned to the parish of St. Pius V in Providence. So our talks are continuing. I am teaching a class, Honors 480, an Honors Colloquium in Science and Religion this semester. And believe me, they've asked the questions. And it's wonderful to be able to propose possible answers. And then my own laboratory is funded by grants from the NSF, the NIGMS, and the Rhode Island INVI program, which is the federal government science infrastructure program for the state of Rhode Island. Thank you very much. Any questions? Father?
I was under the understanding the concept of the magisterial document proposing a multiplicity allowance.
Yes, it was actually in the discussion of original sin.
In Trent, there's no magisterial statement stating a multiplicity allowance
Of
atoms.
atoms, right. In fact, they avoided that question completely.
There's no magisterial document declaring the multiplicity of people upon original sin. Yeah.
The church has been quiet on that.
And the issue that you've skipped is how original sin is passed on, because I had this debate this afternoon on paper metaphysicists who said the debate is it about education or human generation? So if we say it's about human generation, one couple of saying all the rest, we completely undermine the idea that human original sin is passed on by generation. And there's no need for the immaculate conception there, because if original sin is passed on in education rather than generation, we have no need for spotless virgin to give birth to the incarnate word. If you're reconciling, is it an educational formation issue rather than a human generation by passing on original sin? There is no need for immaculate conception.
I mean, I struggled with that question until I read Aquinas. And Aquinas' account to me is incredibly powerful because the one thing that I find so illuminating is how our brother Aquinas wants to say. So I give you were lions meat eaters before the fall? Okay, so now it's interesting because many of my friends who are Protestants were saying that everything was vegetarian, right? And that the fall was so meat eating only happened after the fall. Now, Aquinas will deal with this in his discussion on the original state, and he will say to say that is to give sin more power than you should give it. Because you see, if you say that before the fall lions were vegetarian and they were then meat eaters, carnivores after, then you have to say that sin was so powerful it could change nature. Right?
It's the same thing.
I prefer Aquinas.
It's very difficult to Aquinas for the Immaculate Conception, because he is considered the world's expert on the Immaculate Conception. My issue is, we have completely ignored the issue of the original sin passed on by human generation or by education.
Well, I'm saying that, so if it's a deprivation, so Aquinas' notion is that the preternatural gifts were given to the original people, they were then removed, they were rejected. And so the preternatural gifts were then rejected, and so human nature, which in its in its fallen state, so when Adam and Eve had children, they just gave to Adam and Eve their children their nature. But their nature was deprived of these preternatural gifts that we should have had. And he talks about the infused knowledge to strengthen the intellect, right? The ordering of the will. The will is ordered to reason. The sensitive appetites are ordered towards the higher powers. And then the impassibility and the basically immortality of the body. So these were gifts that were given to us through that's the notion of the original justice. And so when our parents' original forebears rejected them, so when they were propagated, they simply could give what they could give, and they could not give those preternatural gifts. So original sin that is by generation, not because they gave us original sin, but the deprivation, the absence of these preternatural gifts are simply handed down one generation to the other. And the idea of the Immaculate Conception is that at the moment of her conception, the Mother of God was given the gifts that Adam and Eve had. Well, not all of them, some of them, that preserved her in a state where she was not subject to the deprivation that we all experience. And so she was the Ark of the Covenant, the new Ark of the Covenant, to allow the Word to be conceived in her, as we will remember next week.
By the virgin birth, she was totally separated from human generation. Right point.
Virgin birth.
Giving birth to her son as a virgin.
Well, I think oh, sure.
Yeah. So she was totally separate. I think that's the big issue with human generation. I mean, it's a wonderful thing.
So she was conceived in her parents, right? So she herself was conceived the way that we are all conceived. It's just that at the time of her conception, she was given gifts that were denied us. Now, well, her son was God. So that's, I'm sorry? Well, I think we can say this. She gave him a share in his in her human nature. The X chromosome. His X chromosome came from his mother. His Y chromosome came from the Holy Spirit. And so he has a human nature fully like ours. And in a sense, he foreshadows our human nature as it will be glorified.
Is your scheme where there's a cross-fertilization?
cross-fertilization.
From the Han, the Melanesian, the French. When Pope John Paul II spoke for humanity, he intimately connected to personhood. Okay, and that's my drama to think that Ratzinger said you must keep a few fixed points in the line. For me, generation is one. I appreciate what you said. I don't agree. But the second one is we have a humanity that may be in this schema somewhat deprived of personhood. Albeit what you said about separating, polygenesis and leading to racism. That's my anxiety about this. When we're using this word humanism, rather than saying pre-human, we end up saying subhuman somehow, because where does personhood begin in this?
So that's a wonderful question. As you notice in my account, I point out that the human comes to be when the rational soul is given.
The word.
I'm sorry?
Language. The word.
Well, right. Okay. So, so we now have to talk about the spiritual origin. So the soul that is given to the first human being is of a radically different kind than the souls of pre-hominins, or the hominins that we're talking about. They're not persons, exactly. So the persons properly speaking are rational animals. And so so my students will come up with these questions. Well, does that mean that Adam and Eve's grandparents were not human? And you say yes. Or subhuman or pre-human, or they're non-persons. I mean, that's the best way to put it. Now, of course, we live in an age today, and this is the other half of my brain, the bioethics side, where personhood becomes so slippery that human rights that have usually been reserved to persons are now being extended to non-human so-called persons.
But my drama is, you're saying this is human tissue by DNA.
Mm-hmm.
The drama is in our embryonic stem cell debate that our opponents are saying, well, it's human tissue DNA-wise, but it's not a person. And we're saying an embryonic stem cell represents radically a personhood. And that's
Okay, not an embryonic stem cell. We actually do not say that. We have to say the embryo. Okay, so the embryonic stem cell, which is derived from the embryo, we do not attribute personhood. Now, the difference, we say, is that the reason why an embryonic stem cell is not a person while an embryo is because there is an organismal quality associated with the embryo that is not present in the stem cell. And that we have to talk about the human organism. And the human organism, why is the human organism, now going back to hylomorphic theory, now predisposed to be infused by a rational soul? And we can talk about that.
the drama is this line of argument, to me, undermines our fight.
In what way?
Well, we start saying an embryo is a person, okay, but once you've got stem cells from embryos, you don't identify them in the same way.
That's true, because if I scratch my skin and they fall to the ground,
That's an adult stem cell.
nope, that's actually not true. That's a fibroblast. So it's you have to be very careful with your language.
The is our fight about the embryonic stem cell.
I don't understand why that's the case.
Because we're trying to make a very clear distinction that this embryonic stem cell is representative of a human person.
No, we have to. The embryo is a person. The embryonic stem cell is not a person. In fact, we have to say that over and over because an embryonic stem cell is a cell and not an organism.
I get your point, but the line, the argument, at time pushes, Bush said we would allow some stem cells.
Yep.
Carmel in California says that this is a huge change. We're no longer making this an identity. It's like saying the human remains that we use in Auschwitz.
Okay.
And you say that's, I don't want to go to too much concentration camp.
No.
But you're saying this is not representative of a person. Anyway, I'll take up far too much time. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, I have just two things briefly. Right? First is I think I can clarify what Father's saying, if I understand it correctly. Your hypothesis is that the first man and the first woman, or the first group of people, are born of fully physically human, biologically human organisms that are not personal. So if there could be a non-personal human organism biologically in the past, why can't there be that?
Right. So if you notice, I talked about a mutation. So what I'm saying is that, no, in fact, what I'm proposing is that, and we're going down to the detail that is simply beyond the purview of the type of science that we're doing right now. Right? What I'm saying is that there is a biological, physiological change such that the hominins prior to this hominization are actually not only, they are physiologically and genetically different from before the hominization as compared to after. The problem is we do not have a record of that. All we know is that there's cultural differences, and we can trace the cultural differences. And so I'm positing, and again, maybe 100 years from now we'll be able to be this clear, but I'm positing that there is some change, it has to be a biological change, that now predisposes the matter for hominization in a way it didn't before.
Okay, then my own question would be something like, if we look at an organism like Homo
Divergence.
right? Here we have a being, some hominid, who buried its dead in a ritual manner. So I think
Is Heidelberg? I know Neanderthals. Right. So
which buried its dead in a ritual manner. Now, to me, that says a spiritual nature. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, sure.
So then, would you suggest that this is a prelapsarian being?
Right. So in my third year of formation, I had wrote a 25-page paper on whether or not Neanderthals had rational souls. And I mean, that's something many can think about, right? So you sit there and you go through, it was from my philosophical anthropology class. And so I had to go through the history, like what do we know about Neanderthals? And I mean, it was a 25-page paper. Basically, I was saying, this is really crazy. I posited, because yes, they were able to bury their dead, but what is very clear is that they did not have a fully, their tool work and their ability to, and this was what I was saying, their ability to abstract was limited. So you look at their tools, and you can tell, like if you look at our ancestors, when they made tools, you could tell that they had a plan in their brain, and they were able to make these cutting tools based on a plan. And that's where you know there's abstraction. But we were having difficulties seeing that in the Neanderthals, and so for this long, convoluted reason, I said that they had souls that were not as fully rational as ours. And you'll say, well, for an Aristotelian, you have to find a specific difference for that. And you're like shaking your head. And you have to go and look at Aristotle, right? And so you have to sit there and you have to, again, this is where you sit there and you go and you try to explain how to put it all together. I mean, this is the same, you go look at the American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly, they're trying to figure out if aliens have souls. I mean, and in fact, Aquinas will look at this 800 years ago. He will look to see if extraterrestrials are also human, they're also rational. How can you conclude that? So I'm not going to go into that any further because I'd have to go into Aristotelian philosophical anthropology to explain. I basically said they couldn't laugh, but that's a different, because the ability to laugh is a specific difference. You actually, I don't know if you realize that to see a joke requires abstraction. And it is the quality that defines, if you go look at Aristotle and Aquinas, it is the ability to have humor that is profoundly human. You'll never see a dog laugh or a monkey laugh because to see a joke is an abstraction. You know, you see someone walking and they slip on a banana and you laugh. Why? Why do you find it? And that, it turns out there's a whole explanation for to see a joke. The ability to see a joke means you have to be able to abstract two things that happen to be together in ways that they shouldn't be together. So like you see, Sister President walking and she slips on you're like, Sister President, banana. It's very funny because of this juxtaposition of abstractions. And so I basically end up saying they couldn't laugh. Yes.
I'm not sure I follow you, Father. Are you saying Neanderthals were persons or not?
No, I didn't. I said they were not persons. Now, what is striking is this was before we knew they interbred, and this is actually a question in biology today. Are Neanderthals and our species the same species, given that they were able to breed and have reproductively viable offspring? This is tricky because biologically we define species by the ability to produce viable offspring. And if 4% of my genes come from the Neanderthals, then obviously there were reproductively viable offspring when a human and a Neanderthal bred. So I'm actually, and this is something I actually am beginning to posit that one of the difficulties with the biological definition of species, which limits speciation to mating, is that it does not take into account the more philosophical, abstract, the ability to abstract, to look at nature in a way that we need to. Yes?
If breeding takes place between a Neanderthal who is not a person and a non-person who is a person, are the offspring persons?
Oh, well, I don't know. I will ask the Lord that. I mean, that's one of those things that's beyond reason right now. Like, I cannot tell. It's hard to know how, there are possibilities. They're all persons. Some are persons, some are not. You see, so there are all sorts of possibilities. This is one of the things I'll ask him when I see him face to face.
But today the implications are trying to make a half human, half animal.
Oh, no, and not only that, you haven't raised the question. Bestiality, right? I mean, so if a human being mated with an animal, what do we say about that? Now, you have to understand this is nothing new because Aquinas will talk about how about incest? Because clearly, if you have Adam and Eve, right? If you have Adam and Eve are the only two, and they have kids, and there's all of us here, something had to happen. You understand? So, who did Cain marry? Now, so Aquinas will spend, not just Aquinas, the tradition will spend a lot of time talking about there is an early dispensation at the very beginning of time, because otherwise, what are you going to say? All these people are committing a grave moral injustice. I mean, they're mating with their siblings. You see, so there are theological. So are there questions? Yes, but there have been questions for 2,000 years.
But one of the fixed points of Ratzinger was there was no gradual installment.
Yep, I'm not saying there's.
Well, if we've got these Neanderthals.
Well, that's why I'm not saying it was a gradual. I'm actually saying it's another kind of soul that doesn't exist anymore. Nope. Mm-hmm. And that 25-page paper has never been published, thanks be to God. Yep.
Yes, I understand you that kind of, if you look at the scientific story, there's this line of demarcation that you're placing with that volcano, that prior to that event, we had human creatures, and after that event, we had human persons starting to develop.
Well, more properly, I would say that it's not. So I'm saying not the volcano wasn't it. I'm saying that after the volcano, the ancestral population, we call them archaic humans, got really, really small. What was left was really small because they had to deal with basically an ice age that was rapid. That you have a very small population. And it's surprising that you have that shrinking, that bottleneck in the population size coinciding with an apparent radical change in their behavior. And so I'm saying, is it possible? I'm just saying, is it possible that it was at that point that you have this harmonization event of some sort?
And from a theological perspective, that's the birth of the soul.
Well, exactly. At that point, philosophically and theologically, that would be the point where prior to that, humans would not have a spiritual, rational soul, and after that, we have a spiritual, rational soul. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, let me say thank you very much for coming. I feel a little uncomfortable at all the very, very open to embracing it too. So, talk about evolution, and it's really, that's kind of been the underlying assumption that...
Is it true?
Yes. So, when I imagine sort of stereotypical evolution, you have the rules of time, right? And, creatures evolving and changing from one species into another one, and another one. So, and eventually into human beings. So, number one is that what you're saying? And number two, how would you explain creatures that have a symbiotic relationship, or like a nerve cell that has to receive a certain stimulus and then has to have the interpretation, in the brain, and like those things would have had to happen coincidentally by themselves at the exact same time? Like that's not making sense.
Okay, so I will deal with your first question first by going back to Aquinas. If you go to question 103 to 106 of the Prima Pars, where he talks about the governance of the world. So how does God guide his creation? One of the things that, again, was illuminating for me is he said that it is striking that one of the things that God can do is he can give the dignity of causality to his creation. And what does that mean in English? What that means is this, right? You and I can write books, but you and I cannot make a book that writes itself. So the thing that is so awesome about God is that he can give what he makes the power to be makers on their own. Which is why Aquinas will say that it is incredibly amazing that he gave us the ability to be authentic causes. And he says it is properly speaking, it is more proper to divine action that God give his creatures the ability to create rather than he create something himself. Because you and I can create things, but we can't make things that create themselves. So theologically, we have to start with that. So we assume that it is more awesome that God made creation like this. Boom. But Aquinas is saying that could we not see that God saying, all right, I'm going to make this amazing universe, and I am going to give this universe the ability to make new things, to evolve. Now, so that's the first thing. The second thing now is the thing about Aquinas in the discussion on fate, like the governance of the universe, question 107 on fate. People would ask, well, is there fate? Is everything just governed by God, by chance? And he will say, well, God guides the world from within. And so he can make things happen from within without undermining or destroying their nature. So with these two theological principles in mind, the proposition is this: could God not have made a world 13.8 billion years ago when we had the Big Bang, and given that world that he created the ability to evolve, and that he guided that evolution at every single moment, knowing that eventually, 150,000 years ago, he would make something in his image and likeness? You see, so you have to be able to imagine this incredibly... The way I see God is, he's a painter. And he's painting this amazing picture. And sometimes he just has to paint the background first. Now, he knows what it's going to be. And you might occasionally you go, oh my God, it looks terrible. It looks really slimy, right? But he knows what it's going to be, because he's going to make it. So 13.8 billion years, first of all, you've got Adam and Eve, right? And then you have his mother. Oh my God, perfect creature. Yeah? There she is. And that's like the epitome of creation, is the mother of God. Because her son is special. But when I look at creation, I go, where did creation rise to its point? The mother of God. And so, which is why, for example, people will say, why did the Lord choose bread for the Holy Eucharist? And Aquinas will say that's inverted. he made bread for the Eucharist. So 13.8 billion years ago, in the course of evolution, he knew that bread would evolve because he planned that so that his son would be able to take those crushed stalks and transform them into his body. I mean, that's really, we have to, the thing about Aquinas is you see it completely differently. I mean, and we have it, see, we are a world where we see the world as being the center of the universe. God is the center of the universe. And so my brothers have worked very hard to convert me, who is a materialist. I'm a materialist and a Jansenist and a Pelagian all at once. And my brothers have worked incredibly hard to using theology and lots of prayer to change my mind on these things. So with regards to your question on thought, we have to remember that thought is primarily in the soul. Now, this is very hard. I have to hit my head because I'm like, it's in the brain. No, the brain, it's primarily in the soul, working in and through the brain. But we have to be very careful. So we go, well, is it the... So when you talk about the neurons and the glia and all of that, it was all there, but it couldn't think. It could not do the abstraction because matter is restricted. Matter, by its very definition, has limits to it. And so you needed a spiritual principle in order to liberate matter so that it was able to think not only just eternal thoughts, right? But just, I can go to Rome in my mind now. That is, when you think about that, I can move there in my mind, and that is the soul working. My dog can never do that. I could take him to Rome, but I couldn't say, all right, come back now, go to Rome. He's unable, his matter is trapped in its materiality. And so you need the soul to liberate matter, and that's how we have thought. And that's how we have language. Because language requires universals. I need to say things like boy, or even more, beauty. When my students in science and religion are all materialists, and first of all they go, we don't have free will, Father. And I smack one of them, and I go, I'm sorry, I didn't have free will, I had to smack you. But Father said, you see? So you come down and you see how we are so materialistic, not in the sense of consumeristic, which we are, because of fallen human nature, but also we think in terms of matter. And what Aquinas allows us to do is he challenges us to see the world as God sees the world. Yes, sister?
I was just wondering about, we keep talking about microevolution and how microevolution seems to be really forwarding the thinking. And you're raising that macroevolution is scientifically verifiable. So is what you're proposing suggesting that macroevolution is possible but only in union with the actual body? And then if so, can life come from non-life? Like is what you're saying that life can come from non-life, and again, only the union with the actual body?
Okay, so I'll start by saying that, as our brother Aquinas will point out, everything that is created, everything that exists, falls under God's providence. So that's the very first thing. So anything that happens with matter, God makes. God does, he guides. He calls to himself, number one. The second thing is that the difference between matter and non-living matter and living matter is not as wide and is not as vast as the difference between living non-rational matter and living rational matter. And if we are able to say without a blink of an eye and say that we can make, when you're talking about making living matter from non-living matter, if we say that God is able to make rational matter from non-rational matter, then the transition between living matter and non-living matter is actually much smaller. And so I say yes. I will say that yes. I will attribute to the providence of God, who is 3 in 1, right? The ability to make living out of non-living. Do we know how he did that? No, we do not. We do not know. We can see the beginning, we can see the matter, we can see the living matter. We have not been able to pinpoint that transition. We know it happened. We don't know how it happened at the natural level. I know that however it happened at the natural level, God was working through it providentially. Now, you raised the question between macroevolution and microevolution. Now, it's striking because from a biological perspective, there is no difference mechanistically between microevolution and macroevolution. It's a matter of time. Microevolution, given enough time, will look like macroevolution. Now, a lot of people will say, well, I don't know how dogs and cats could have evolved. I mean, they're so different. You know, how could they evolve from a common ancestor? And I tell the story about how in Mexico, there are American tourists who go to Mexico and they buy what they thought was a really, really cute dog, and it turned out to be a rat. Right? So now it's really interesting. It's really interesting because it tells you something about how we perceive dogs. You know, if you have a little Chihuahua and a German Shepherd, the differences between those two organisms is vast. And, I mean, but we don't need a supernatural explanation to explain how these two breeds, the differences in these breeds were generated from a common ancestor. And I believe the most recent data is that they evolved from wolves several times, about 14,000 years ago. So you have these breeds, right? So if we're able to accept that the Chihuahua and the German Shepherd or the Swiss Bernard were both bred. Now, I ask you, is that macroevolution or microevolution? Now, of course, it's directed evolution because human beings did that. But what you can see is biologically, you can generate that diversity from within the pool. And so now we'd have to say, well, is that happening in a sense without reason guiding it? And this is where we'd have to dump the debate about natural selection. But I would always say, regardless of what we say, God is guiding it. So it's never chance versus creation. He creates through evolution. That's actually very interesting. So there is a lot of recent data, especially from the genetics, that suggests that single point mutations can so radically change an animal that it's not as gradual as we had thought. Now, you understand, and the reason being is that we have found these master genes. So there's this gene called PAX6, which is the gene important for the formation of the eye. Now, you'll go, well, so what? It turns out that the eye, human beings, I don't know if you know that there are babies who are born with a single eye at the center of their head. Okay? And this is we think this is where the whole notion of the Cyclops came from. And they have a mutation in PAX6, the human PAX6. If you mutate the PAX6 gene in a fly, the fly is born with no eyes. Now, what's interesting is if you take that single PAX gene and I put it into a fly, I can genetically convert one of the fly's legs into an eye. So I show this picture where all of a sudden, instead of legs, you've got extra eyes. Now, you've got a whole bunch of eyes that are sticking out. One gene can convert a leg into an eye. Now, you go, well, that's amazing, because you would think you would need gradual changes to go from leg to eye or eye to leg. It's a single gene. And so we think that we don't know anything. We don't even have anything close to an explanation, but we can begin to see ways where we can see a much more, let's just put it, less gradual, much more jumpy evolution where there is a much bigger morphological change than what we would expect. Yes, ma'am.
On a more practical note, if we wanted to have our genes read, there's lots of companies on the web and stuff like that. I mean, mean, I thought about it, just for fun. Are there any more reputable than others? It seems like it would be.
So there's okay. This is very interesting. So I just wrote. We are about to pass the $1,000 genome. In the next couple of weeks, there's a company that it's going to release the next generation sequencing, which will mean we'll be able to sequence our genes, our entire genome, all of our genes, for about $300 or $400. Now you'll go, that's really expensive. When you think that an MRI costs $1,000, okay, basically you can sequence 3 genomes for the cost of an MRI, and insurance will cover it. Now this is both exciting but also very troubling for the following reason. Now I showed you my genome had been it's typed. It had not been sequenced. It's called its haplotype, and what they do is they check particular regions of the Y chromosome, and they're able to figure out my genetic ancestry based on that. But we're now going to be able to identify every single mutation in your genome. Now what this means is a couple of things are going to come about. First of all, you're going to discover that you have genetic mutations in you that predispose you to some malady later in age.
I don't want that. I just want to find out.
The best way to do that, National Geographic, $99. And you only have to do it for one in the family, right? So my students will all put, like, when I told them about this, they're like, oh, so they asked for their Christmas present. They asked their family to contribute to $99, so then they would have their genomes mapped, and they would be able to tell if they were Vikings or...
That's part of the IBM project, isn't it?
This is the IBM National Geographic Project. That's correct. So I would rather do that than one of the other ones. Like the other stuff is much. Now I have students who want to know it, but I tell them be very, very careful, because even if it doesn't affect you, I tell you, especially for the women, it says something about your children. And I think for women, I find that's more, because I'm a biologist as a priest, so it also happens that people come talk to me who want to ask any of these questions. They'll say, Father, we have a BRCA1 mutation that's segregating in my family. How do I deal with that? So I end up being genetic counselor as well. It's amazing how things happen when you are a priest of Jesus Christ. It's a wonderful apostolate. But you get to talk to lots of these people, especially on airplanes, and they have all these questions, and you're trying to answer them, and you're cautioning them because it's not a game. See, a lot of people, it's cool to find out if you're a Viking, but it's not so cool if you're carrying a BRCA1 mutation that's not going to affect you, but your daughter is going to have a problem. She's going to get breast cancer. She's going to have radical mastectomies before she's 30. I mean, that sort of information is really, really, we have to be very careful about how to deal with that. And I'm telling you right now, the next boom, genetic counselors. And I'll tell you, what we need is we need Catholic genetic counselors. We do not have enough, and we don't have many. And the problem is that genetic counseling today is so anti-life that any single mutation is an immediate call for an abortion. And we need to be able to provide genetic counselors who respect the gospel of life, who are able to recognize and appreciate the dignity of the human person, even someone who has Down syndrome. 95% of all Down's babies are aborted today. Yes?
On that score, as a theologian and someone who teaches moral theology a lot, it seems to me that we might need to think about a new category of what the church has traditionally called occult knowledge. Right? So there are things that we can come to know that we actually have no right to know. I don't have a right to know what somebody else's wife looks like naked or something. Right? I don't have any right to know that. I could come to know it, but I don't have a right to that knowledge. Now the question is, do I have a right to this knowledge, the knowledge of the sorts of genes that cause these mutations that would lead to serious
psychological, spiritual, familial problems? Now I'm telling you, like the occult information, it's got Facebook all over it. I mean, we, like I was speaking today, we need a modesty of soul. We've lost that. Like my students will post status updates about every little thing. And there's not the sense that there's a part of me that I have to keep hidden between me and my Lord. And this is what I said, St. Joseph is hidden, and he does everything in a hidden way. And so this is an example for that. It's just going to get worse. It's going to get worse. Because now people are going to post. So with these personal genomic services, you actually can post your genome online, and then you can find potential girlfriends or boyfriends by matching genomes. You can imagine, I mean, if I got my genome, I'm now going to like post it. I mean, we do. You know, I have to say, I've been impressed by CatholicMatch.com. I've met so many couples recently in the last 6 months who are getting married on CatholicMatch.com. I didn't understand it because I've never been on. No need to be on CatholicMatch.com. But there's students at PC and alum who have used it, and they've told me about it. So I've come to appreciate it. But having said that, putting your personal genetic information online where everybody can see it, number one. Number two, what happens when the government, and the government is not like, right now the government is not so virtuous, okay? And they're demanding information and demanding things that we do that violate our conscience and violate the very founding principles of our country. And so what happens now when all of a sudden you get your genome sequence and an insurance company gets to demand it from you? And they'll say, because you may get sick when you are 90 years old, we are going to jack up your insurance rate when you are 25. You can see that, right? They're going to start putting that all in. They're going to say, okay, not only are we going to have a mandate for contraceptives, you know, I tell my students, are we going to be paying for condoms next? Because basically that's where we're going. And now you have, what about this? Now we have a genome too. We're going to have to post the genomes up. And they're going to, the insurance companies are going to go for that. Because if they know your genome, they know what you're going to get sick from, even if you're not sick from it now and won't be for the next 15 years.
Well, the government says that two people cannot get married because they would produce someone with a genome that...
And we, genetic counseling has that today, especially, for example, in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, because the Tay-Sachs mutation is so common in their pedigrees. You actually have matchmakers. You have matchmakers of old. I understand they're Jewish moms, is what I've been told. Now the mother of God, must have been an amazing Jewish mom when you think about it, right? And they match. Part of what they do is they actually have you tested for the particular allele associated with Tay-Sachs to make sure that before you even meet somebody and fall in love with them, you've already got yourself tested. But you can imagine how, your kid is born, and within 5 seconds, we know what he'll die from, probability-wise. Any other questions? Thank you very much. Our help is in the name of the Lord.